Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the MedTech Impact Podcast, where you get to hear from leaders and innovators who are shaping the future of medical technology. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn.
And we're your hosts of the show.
So, today on the MedTech Impact Podcast, we are delighted to be joined by Dan Rhodes, former CEO of LimFlow. Dan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Well, Dan, we are super excited. I mean, I have to say, for us, normally we see a lot of the earlier stage innovators. You are at the other end of the spectrum. You have been there and done it. So we are so excited to have you on the show and share the whole story of LimFlow. Before we get into that, though, we do like to frame it for the audience. So please tell us the big problem that LimFlow is solving.
So LimFlow was focused on the problem of what's called chronic limb-threatening ischemia, CLTI, also used to be called critical limb ischemia. And essentially you're talking about people who have reduced blood flow to the foot, right? Because of atherosclerosis, buildup of plaque and calcium in their arteries, right? We know that happens in the heart, and that's why people have myocardial infarctions. But if you're accumulating calcium in the heart, you're likely accumulating it everywhere else as well. So what you ultimately get is reduced blood flow to the foot, and it often presents in the presence of diabetes, right? And we all know diabetics have a propensity for diabetic foot ulcers. And if you combine kind of a diabetic foot ulcer, a wound on your foot of any type, and insufficient blood flow, you're going to have a hell of a time healing that wound on your foot, right? And so, and this is a pernicious and pervasive problem. Many people end up getting major lower limb amputations every year. It's over 100,000 Americans every year get a major lower limb amputation, and it is tied very closely to mortality. So when you lose your limb, you very often, very soon after that amputation, lose your life. That reduction of mobility is terrible, and the surgical insult is difficult. And these patients often have several other chronic diseases going on, all basically the vast majority hypertension, diabetes, renal issues. A lot of them have had previous MIs. So when you have that kind of last step of a major lower limb amputation, kind of everything else catches up with you. So the longer you can keep the limb on, the longer you can keep someone alive. So that's the core problem. And we all are aware of the presence and the increasing prevalence of diabetes in America, closely tied to obesity. This is a big problem that has generally been very difficult to solve.
Yeah, Dan, I mean, honestly, it's staggering some of the numbers you packed in there. And if you go on the LimFlow website, you talked about amputation. Every 2 minutes, a leg is amputated in the US and Europe. And you're talking about the mortality rates, 10% dying before they leave hospital. 50% of patients with amputations secondary to PAD die within 12 to 24 months. These are staggering figures. As you mentioned there's just an increasing volume of patients who are suffering from these symptoms. I wonder if you could expand now on some of the causes of these. I know this is something we spoke about before offline when we were sort of discussing getting you on as a guest. Diabetes being one of them, but what else are you seeing in this space?
Well, we see an incidence of all of these kind of chronic diseases often happening even earlier and earlier now. So you have more and more people being obese, having diabetes, having a bad diet, which can lead to atherosclerosis, not taking care of themselves. Poor access to care is a critical issue in CLTI. So it predominantly, or not predominantly, but heavily impacts underserved and underprivileged communities, the African American community, the Native American community, Hispanic community. And you see it at horrendous levels in these healthcare deserts we have in the US, right? Where it's very difficult to find a GP. It's very difficult to even find a hospital, right? Much less specialized care. So, there are a lot of factors that kind of line up with the trend of diseases and chronic disease in America, and lack of investment in kind of general healthcare, right, and basic healthcare and preventative healthcare, which leads to patients, one, having diabetes early. You know, we see type 2 diabetics at 25, right, and not at 65 anymore. And if you have type 2 diabetes at 25, when you're 45, you're going to have all the major complications we used to see in 80 and 90-year-olds. And that includes diabetic foot ulcers. So we're seeing a younger population, we're seeing more patients, and we're frankly not making the investments in the healthcare system in the places that are going to alleviate this by catching it early with a peripheral artery disease diagnosis, or getting people to their GPs. So if they have a problem on their foot, it can be identified early. What you end up with is people who can't afford to get to the hospital showing up to the ER with a wet gangrene at 2 o'clock in the morning in a center that doesn't have specialized care, and then you're off to amputation. So there's a lot of opportunity to do better, right? And we always talk about that. But it's not only the problem in terms of the healthcare system, it's also a problem of technology.
You know, and Richard, Dan, you guys did an incredible job at, talking about the problem here. Obviously, this is massive. So let's get into the solution here. How is LimFlow addressing the problem today?
Well, so the LimFlow solution is a little bit different from what had traditionally been tried in CLTI, which was, the beginning of treating, obviously, surgical solutions for CLTI and have been around for a long time. Surgical bypass was the main way of doing it, essentially, creating a bypass between, the artery in your upper leg down to the foot, right? Which is great if you can do it, right? It's great if your disease isn't so advanced that there's no artery to tie sew the bypass onto in your foot. So that's a solution, but for a select group of patients, because also there are not enough vascular surgeons in America. And so that's not often possible. And a lot of our patients are failed bypass patients as well. So they had it helped them for a while, but then their disease progresses. The endovascular tools have been in development for a long time. We all know about stents and catheters and balloons. And these were primarily developed initially for the heart, and then they've been adapted, basically to expand indications going south. But the problem with those tools in the lower limb, also called BTK or below the knee, has been lesions are very long, right? You're not dealing with a 20-millimeter lesion, you're dealing with a 250-millimeter lesion. Disease is diffuse. And you've got joints and big muscles moving around, which tend to, fracture stents if you leave them there. So a lot of the tools that we use traditionally to do endovascular work to open up arteries don't work very well below the knee, right? And the disease and anatomical issues are really more difficult than almost anywhere else you can have to work with. So what we saw was there was a number of patients, somewhere between 15 and 20% of patients, who are what's called no option patients. So physicians would look at them, they would offer them bypass, they would offer them endovascular tools, they would fail. And at some point they'd say, look, I can't do anything for you, right? I can't get blood flow to your foot. And in these patients, LimFlow was designed for these patients. And the way LimFlow works is by saying, okay, philosophically, this pathway is blocked. It's a little bit like when you're driving to the airport on the highway, you get stuck in traffic, and your app tells you you're going to get there tomorrow, not today, right? You're stopped. And you say, well, how am I going to, get where I need to be, catch my plane? And you look across the median and you see that there's a road on the other side of the median that goes to the airport. It just runs the wrong way. And this is true in the body. We have arteries and veins. Veins take blood away from the heart. Arteries take blood back to the heart. Arteries go to where veins come from. So they run alongside each other throughout the body. There are also more veins than arteries. There are also often multiple veins for every artery. And we harvest veins to do things in the body. So you can use one up without necessarily causing, a problem for the patient. So ultimately, LimFlow is designed to create a connection between artery and vein in the lower limb, use that vein to deliver red oxygenated blood to the deep tissue of the foot, right? And turn that into that vein essentially into an artery, right?
Mhm.
Not physically, but it's serving that function so that the foot can get the blood it needs to heal, right? And that's the outcome we're looking for the patient is healing in the foot, keeping the limb. And so that's it. So it's a system of catheters that create the connection between artery and vein,
Mm-hmm.
a tool called a valvulotome that takes out the valves in the veins that keep blood from flowing in the wrong direction, and then some covered stents that are specifically designed for this application so that the blood goes all the way down to the foot. So long explanation, but that's kind of the concept.
Well, those are just what it is though, Dan, is that you just did such a great job at using these analogies, right? I know a lot of folks in the audience, they can get lost in a lot of the technical language. So to provide those really easy to understand analogies of, going to the airport and there being a lane right there, it's like, hey, that reminds me of the breakdown lane that we use here in Boston to get to that airport a lot sooner, right? At least hopefully you're traveling with another person in the car.
Well,
But nevertheless, I mean, I totally get what you're saying there. And I'm glad you got in, you kind of touched too on the technology side, that catheter technology that's going into the body, that's clearly helping with some sort of blockage, right? And then it sounds like there is some sort of stent or device that's being implanted. Is that correct?
yeah, so the covered stents effectively sit it just above the crossing point from artery to vein and then overlap all the way down to the ankle. So you can imagine it's like, essentially just shunting that blood from the red side of the body down this tube, right, which is traditionally holding blue blood, and
Mm.
then into the venous system in the foot where it disperses and ultimately delivers, oxygen and red blood cells to the wound. So that's the idea. Again, it runs counter to kind of page 2 of an anatomy textbook. It's not the way you're supposed to use a vein, uh, and it's an idea that's been around for a long time, about 100 years, but was always done surgically. And when it was done surgically, you end up creating a big surgical wound. And so, it was difficult to see whether or not the technique was working because patients would lose their limb due to the surgical wound. And so what we can do in medtech now is do things, really minimally invasive, two tiny punctures. And so you can see whether this principle is working with much less, how would you say, much less surgical insult than you used to have. So that was key.
That's super neat. And again, I love the way, like Kyle said, that you've been able to describe something that's super complicated. I have to then also pay homage to LimFlow's website. You guys have the coolest video which visualizes everything that you just described there. My background is an anatomist. I think, again, you did a wonderful job there, but that visualization is so important as well to be able to tell that story, and it's super neat. I wonder now for you, Dan, to tell us a little bit more about, how did you get involved in this? Because you mentioned, this is a lot of science and background has gone into this type of technology, this type of approach. But how did you personally get involved with LimFlow?
Well, so it's a funny story. So LimFlow was the idea of a British cardiologist named Dr. Martin Rothman, and he had this idea. But as you know, it's difficult for physicians to take ideas and suddenly build a company and commercialize them. And so there's an incubator called MD Start that was designed to specifically to do this, funded by Medtronic and Covidien and Sorin and Versant Ventures and Sophie Nova. And so they took this idea, they invested a few $1 million in building prototypes, developing the concept, getting the first in man together and performing the first in man procedures, which was 13 cases done in Singapore. So that took a few years. I had actually seen and met Tim Lenahan at the beginning of the project, and he was like, "What do you think, Dan, about this?" And I said, "Well, this is too early for me. That's what I think, but I love it. But I do, a little bit later stuff. That's my comfort zone." as one has ever get, as much as one ever gets comfortable in this business, right? I feel better later. And so he went off and did it. And then I started looking for a CEO job just at the same time that they were raising the Series B. And I ran into Tim again, and he's like, "Hey, we now have full money for a CEO. We've got 3/4 of the Series B raised. You'd be the first employee, right?" And so, yeah, that's when I joined, became CEO. I asked Tim to stay on as CTO for a year while I put the team in place and, kind of started the journey. And it was 4 years of incubation from founding till I joined in 2016, and then it was 7 years from there to selling the company. So these are long projects, right? And it was a PMA process, so with all the things that go into that, because we do leave the stents in the body. So, it's one of the heaviest regulatory asks that you can have.
So it's quite the journey, and it's interesting when you talk about that timing, because that's something we hear again and again, like in terms of what happens in your life and the decisions you make. Was there anything in particular that drew you to this technology or to this innovation?
There were a couple things. So one, I had worked at Medtronic, and during 2 times I had been, had peripheral under my portfolio. So I knew the peripheral space. It wasn't the core space that I had worked in. I was much more focused on the coronary space or surgical cardiac surgery space. But nonetheless, I knew it. And one thing that struck me is when I really saw what LimFlow was doing, I'm like, wait a minute, I haven't done peripheral for like 10 years, but this is crazy that nothing has progressed really. Like, we still have all these patients we can't treat. We haven't solved this. I mean, there were basically no products with below the knee disease indications approved by the FDA. Nothing, right? So, when I looked at it, I said, this is a true unmet need. And I've always been drawn to those projects that are big unmet needs, right? I'm not so much of a, this is a new flavor of stent or whatever. That's less exciting to me. But these are scary projects because you are going after a big unmet need, and it's not, you got to prove a new way of doing things, and the path is long. But if you win, it really makes a difference for patients, and obviously is a success for everybody involved.
Yeah, and again, this technology has been developed in France, is that correct? So you mentioned about the UK correlation, but there's the background of obviously it being based in France.
So it is a UK physician that went to a Swiss incubator that founded the company in Germany. And then when the Series B came along, BPI France, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of France, led that, and they only invest in French companies. So a French company was established that acquired the German entity. And then we established the US entity. And when we sold the company, 2/3 of the employees were in the US. And I live in Switzerland. So it is very international. That's what I would say. So a lot of paperwork.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's super cool though, Kyle. The fact that they've got this pan-European approach and obviously have made it work over here in the US.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, right? Because I think, Dan, when you came in right around that Series B, you still had some ways to go, it sounded like, because of that PMA regulatory pathway. So I'm hearing like, Richard, there's like a combination here because we talk so much about that regulatory pathway and then go to market strategy. But Dan, like, it sounds like that was all maybe happening at once. And, Richard, I want to start with the go to market here, and then I want to learn more about that regulatory pathway, because I think those are two, key areas that Dan brought a lot of value and leadership to that was critical for to the growth and success of LimFlow.
Well, if we talk about go-to-market strategy, I mean, I think there's so many lessons in our business about how to do it well, right? And I think you really have to identify where you fit in the framework, right? Are you coming in with a technology that already has reimbursement, that already has, essentially competitive products, whether yours might be different, but essentially there is a solution for the patients that you're selling into, and therefore you are, not selling a slightly better solution, but a different solution. But nonetheless, there's an existing market. Physicians are used to diagnosing the patients. They're treating the patients today. You have to kind of see if you're in that pathway or where we were, which is, patients aren't well identified. No option patients can mean different things in the eyes of different physicians. Some may think, well, I could treat that, but the question is, do you treat it effectively or not? So you had to for us, it was a question of, we're gonna be bringing a completely new therapy into a pretty undeveloped space. How do we do that with a goal to becoming the standard of care over time, right? And you do that by figuring out who the best centers are, by really focusing on starting with a key account, best in class centers of excellence approach, where you're going to start out, you're going to train these sites up, you're going to work closely with them, you're going to embed the therapy, and then you're going to expand out from there. Because to be honest, if you're honest with yourself, you don't know how to commercialize the technology, right? You don't know what the sales process is going to be. You've never been in front of a VAC, right? You've never done commercial cases. Are you doing consignment? Are they buying product beforehand? How are you replacing product? How much training is really involved? How quickly can they go up from interest to, contract to first case to, consistent therapy? You don't know if you have to be at every case, right? Or not. And so we looked at all these analogies. We looked at Inari, Shockwave. We looked at Silk Road a lot because they were working with vascular surgeons. So we looked at all the different models, right? And if you had conversations, and thankfully, each of these companies was very kind to us, right? I could talk with the CEO or the chief commercial officer at each one and say, hey, how did you guys do it? What was hard? What was not? Why did you arrive at your particular way of doing things? And to be honest, Penumbra sells differently than Inari does, right? And Shockwave sells different than Medtronic. Each one has come to a system that they believe works, right? And they believe it works, right? Because they've been huge successes. So listening to them and saying, okay, which of these things seems to make sense for us, right? What does that imply in the model we build, right? In terms of our financial calculations, which again, are gonna go in front of some very, very smart venture capitalists who've seen many companies, and in many cases, funded Shockwave or Inari, or these other companies, right? So, and you listen to their feedback as well, because we had some great brainstorming sessions with venture capitalists looking at investing who actually gave us term sheets, but we could sit there and say, hey, what's wrong with our model? What are we not thinking of? What are we not calculating? Do you think it's 3 months to first case, or should it be 5? And what kind of rep do we need? Do we need a clinical rep? Do we need a clinical specialist and a rep? So all these things, right? It's a matter of triangulation, of doing a really thorough job of listening to the market, and then understanding that whatever the plan is, and I used to quote Mike Tyson. I don't know if it's Mike Tyson who actually said it, but my team will repeat this all the time. Everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? And that's exactly what happens. Is you have your plan and you get out there, and some things are different, of course, than you think they're going to be, right? The things that you thought were easy are maybe medium. The things that you thought were hard might be easy. And so you have to be prepared to adapt, right? And not hire 50 rep, for my opinion. If you're going into an established market, right, where the pathway is known, you can hire aggressively and go. But if you're going into something new, I think you have to have a much more cautious kind of, let's bed down the therapy, let's get the great patient outcomes, let's learn how to sell this before we try and conquer the world. And if you don't convince your board to do that, right, and your investors to do that, you're going to be in real trouble, because they're going to want to go fast.
Well, Dan, have you done this before LimFlow?
Well, I've done commercial launches before, yeah, a number of them. So, and everything I said is because I've made lots of mistakes in the past, right?
Sure.
I think that's the key, is reflecting back and said, oh, I was overconfident in this situation. I didn't account for, you have your experience, and especially you come out of Medtronic, you've done 20 product launches, you've seen a bunch of different things, but you've always had Medtronic at your back, right? Right? That's a very different thing than coming in all alone as a tiny little startup, right? You don't have this inertia that helps you carry a launch through. So you got to be ready to dance when you
Well,
get into the game.
absolutely, and you had the relationships too. I think which is huge. I think not only bringing those experiences with you and really understanding, hey, there's no market for this right now. So how we go about this is really a mystery, and we need to really be focused like right there on what's in front of us and take this one day at a time. And to your point, engage with the right centers of excellence, the right stakeholders to be able to get on the horn with an executive leader at an innovative company like you've mentioned, Shockwave and Inari, right? Who obviously came along and acquired LimFlow, but to really have I think those folks and those the venture capital folks too, right? To even understand you, because I hear so many times when you talk to these founders and these leaders, there's a lot of pressure into like, hey, start to generate sales, to show that line of revenue so that they can achieve their growth or exit strategy, whatever that might be. And PMA is also it's just a lot longer game, and a lot goes into it. So just so many valuable nuggets there. I mean, it's really I think valuable for the audience to hear, no matter what part of the industry you're in, to understand that. So
Definitely, absolutely, Kyle. I mean, I think you covered so much in that last section there, Dan. One of the things that jumped to mind and you sort of mentioned, referred to there, was the fact that you were employee number one. I'm wondering, like, has that changed you
And I never let them
personally?
forget it, huh?
Yeah, I'm sure. But yeah, again, when you start, you start as employee number one, it's a whole different perspective. And again, you mentioned you don't suddenly have all the resources that somebody like Medtronic has. But does
Yeah.
that change your sort of personal outlook? How do you feel like you personally grew through that process?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I do think I try and pay attention. I've mentioned it before. I try and pay attention to the things we get right and the things we get wrong, right? And I try and be a leader. And you don't always achieve this, but try and be a leader who really is shoulder to shoulder with the team, right? If you do it right, you accumulate a lot of great people, and we have, hopefully people that are smarter than you and more experienced than you. And even if they're working with you, their advice in many cases is much better than what you're thinking. So I think it's cultivating that situation where you can continue to learn from them, and you can share what is useful experience and perspective that you have. But really, it's about, and I think about this all the time, and I think I did a better job at this than I have it in the past. And what was a better leader is assembling that team, and really working deeply as a team. You never know where the right idea is going to come from, right? And you never know which perspective is necessarily going to play out in the at the end. So you got a lot of smart people around the table, and if they're willing to not play politics but to really get involved, and we'd have, I mean, reimbursement, talking about clinical affairs. We've had regulatory chiming in on R&D, or sales, right? So I think we built a very robust group of people, and we built a very robust process and ethic of solving problems. And that's something I learned to do in this job, really.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I think there's an HBR article famous from back in 2000 that talks about the different leadership styles. And I'm sure as a startup founder or startup CEO, you have to wear numerous hats and depending on the situations you face. But most importantly, that point you make around, staying open-minded, empowering your team to help make decisions. I think these are really wonderful lessons that any founder and any person who's starting a company can take away. You did touch upon the team there, so I'd love to sort of hone in on that now. You were employee number one. What about employee number two, three? what was that like as a process for going out and getting those people?
Well, I mean, that's where the magic is, right? And you have to be smart, but you also have to get really lucky, at the end of the day. And so I was able, thankfully, to involve some people very early on who were who really helped me set the stage. And one of my first hires was Thomas Engels, who is our head of clinical affairs, just a brilliant clinical affairs person, and a brilliant partner to doctors. And we were in a very uncertain space where you don't really there is no therapy, right? So you're inventing the therapy. So how do you measure a therapy that you're inventing, and in a way that the FDA, is going to understand, right? And approve. So there's so much interaction in terms of designing a great clinical program that, and it's a step-by-step process. And we were really focused on our early feasibility study in the US. Then we were focused on our pivotal trial, which was ultimately published in the New England Journal of Medicine. But again, we're starting from scratch. Nobody had ever done this before. No one had ever core lab adjudicated wounds in the way that we had. No one had ever treated no option patients. So a whole new paradigm had to be developed. And finding Thomas was key to that first step, because he formed the core partnership for me in the early days, and stayed through the end. We had a very consistent leadership team for about 6 years. So we added to that with Zachary Woodson, who great regulatory and quality guy, good partner to Thomas. They have to be shoulder to shoulder all the time. Sophie Humbert, who was our only French person on the leadership team, came in and ran ops for us, R&D and manufacturing. And so we continued to build out that team. I was a great believer in talent is truly rare. And so if you find talent and you find cultural fit, you hire it, right? So sometimes you have to pay more than you want to. Sometimes they don't live in the city you want them to live, right? So, but if you find someone who clicks with you, and I think that's really important, from a culture point of view, but then really brings the goods in terms of talent, you go get them. And so we ended up with an incredibly virtual organization, which worked really well in COVID, to be honest. COVID didn't really affect our working style at all, but we were able to pull in just a brilliant group of people. Jenny Gaffney, who was the former head of reimbursement at Medtronic, coronary and renal denervation, left a very big job at Medtronic to be our reimbursement person, which is, again, I think you have to be able to convince people of your vision. And she bought into it and was just an incredible contributor. Mike Mathias, who until he joined us was running Medtronic's TAVR business, over $1 billion in revenue, 500 employees. He left that to be the only commercial person at LimFlow, right? No assistant, no reps, no help, no nothing, right?
He's a one-man team, that sounds
That
like.
was a transition, but I said, hey, look, man, it's yours to build.
Wow.
So, let's go do it together. And we built a world-class commercial core early stage 10 commercial team. But he got into it shoulder to shoulder with us. So, I mean, person after person really contributed, but you gotta be able to sell them on your vision if you want them to really, you want great people to come at the end of the day. I think that's critical.
Yeah, well, clearly you were very good at convincing them, and you managed to assemble a wonderful team. How many of them, or those people in the team, were people you already knew versus people that you had to go and find? Because obviously, again, you were super intentional about building this team.
So the only one I knew was Paul Limmer, who was our head of finance, our VP finance, who had worked with me at the last company. And, so he came when I was setting up finance. I was like, I can trust Paul. I know Paul. I mean, your finance person, you have to trust to the end of the earth, right? I mean, they have, they're just at the center of everything. And if they get something wrong, it's devastating, right? And I had incredible confidence in Paul. And yeah, it's been an amazing working relationship. Your finance person is also, when you're doing a transaction, the person you are really wedded to, right? That person knows everything about the deal, knows everything about the diligence, knows everything about the structure and who's going to make what money. And so having someone that you really trust and is discreet and super competent, that's a critical hire right there. And I just known Paul for 3 years. I think he was dumb enough to come and work for me again, and we formed a really productive partnership, right? And yeah, he's been a great friend and partner through this whole thing, because it's hard. It's a hard journey, right? And he knows how hard, because he knows how much money's in the bank, right? So
Yeah, you need one of them, the money person for sure. And I can't highlight enough how valuable those points you're making in terms of, just being intentional and building a team. Because of course we hear a lot about of founders who come together organically. They may be in some situation in a life that brings them together, but actually the point you were in terms of assembling a really like high caliber team, you went out and found the best. And I think that's something that all founders can learn, that, when you're really passionate about the problem, you need to find other people out in the ecosystem, not just the people necessarily close to you. And so again, that's really great commentary on how you went about building this.
Well, one thing that I'm thinking too, right, is because Dan, you do such a great job at obviously making this, sound like it was all rainbows and butterflies here, bringing this technology to market. Hey, I'm just saying, man. I mean, come on, you're putting together a stellar team. You've got the best, again, centers of excellence, doctors, physicians in the world that you're working with, right? But obviously, there are an element of challenges. I mean, there had to have been certain points along your journey where maybe you felt like, oh man, you got your back against the wall, you're really not sure what direction to go in. I mean, did you ever have any of those experiences? I mean,
ton of them.
yeah,
Oh my
I mean,
God,
what were
yeah.
like some of them? I'm sure you did. What were some of, I guess, like those bigger challenges that stand out, and how did you really overcome those?
Oh, we had lots of challenges. I don't want to go too much in detail, but
Yeah.
we had a hell of a time getting our IDE approved. I mean, that was a challenge across a bunch of different things, right? I mean, there were challenges, with them understanding what we wanted to do. There were challenges with getting our testing in place. We had three catheters plus an ultrasound system plus a bunch of stents. I mean, it was a very complex system, and each one of those has a huge amount of testing involved with it to satisfy the FDA. So we had regulatory challenge after regulatory challenge. I mean, they were. I mean, I'm not blaming the FDA. It was a complex project, right? And we're treating a totally new patient population.
Mhm.
We were breakthrough, and that was helpful. But no, I mean, I beat my head against the wall. I mean, I think we might have had 6 rejections for the IDE.
Okay.
That's a whole lot of time going back to the board and saying, "Oops," that's not what I don't say "oops," but yeah, I'm just
Yeah.
saying those people did um, and so that's part of it. Clearly, we enrolled our first patient in our pivotal trial in December of 2019, and our last patient in March of 2022. And something important happened during that period, which was a global pandemic that happens to be deadly for CLTI patients, because our patients have all of the issues that COVID was, really a great risk for, right?
Wow.
So you think about obese patients, patients with tons of previous comorbidities. I mean, we lost, out of 105 patients, we had 5 mortalities to COVID, right? Like pure, on a respirator in the ICU deaths. And I thought at one point, I think we had like a third of the patients in the hospital with COVID. So, I mean, this was a terrifying time to run a study, and the
Sure.
study took twice as long to run because it was COVID, right?
Mm.
And we never had a month when we didn't enroll. And I kept the study open, which was a deliberate thing. There was a push to close like a lot of companies stopped their studies, right? And I refused. And my thinking was, if I stop the study, what's the piece of information I'm ever going to have that says it's safe to start the study
Mm-hmm.
again? And I couldn't envision
Mm-hmm.
what that would be, where I would be able to say it's safe, you know. So I said, if the site wants to stop, the site can stop. And every site went through a pause at some point. You know, we had these waves, and so sites would stop and start. But I was like, if they say it's safe, we've got to trust their judgment, and we have to keep this going, because if we stop, startups are like sharks. They stop swimming and you die. So
Sure.
we were able to enroll every month. That was really hard. Raising money is always hard. Um, Getting over the line for a PMA, and again, that final PMA submission and discussions with the FDA is also really hard, and it's always hard in ways that you did not expect it to be hard. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm fond of saying, you better have a plan B, because more often than not, plan B is the plan. Uh, you know, sometimes, you hope that you finish with what you were planning to do, but yeah, not always. And that's why you have to have a great team, because you're going to get knocked back, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is not going to, even their great team creates a great plan, you're still going to get knocked back. So, and I don't know any company that, when you get down deep to any of the companies, and the CEOs, the people that drove these great companies and created them, every single one of them has these stories of like, what are we going to do? And how do we do it? Right.
Yeah.
And
Right.
you simply refuse to stop, right? You just
Yeah.
refuse, right? And yeah, that's, so
That's
yeah,
typically,
it's not
what you
all
hear.
daisies and rainbows, that's for
That's
sure.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why it's important to talk about, both sides here, because, there's a bit of resiliency there and perseverance. And, I think like that's just so important, right? Just not stopping, and you got to keep going. And, yeah, it's brilliant. So I guess now, here we are. You've exited, LimFlow experienced their exit with Inari. I think it'd be interesting. Tell us a little bit more about that, and maybe even touch on what you hope to see. Obviously, you're a bit removed now, no longer, I don't think, right, with the organization or with the
No, yeah,
technology.
my integration period is over, but
Yeah. Yeah, so I guess, but tell us about the acquisition there, and where you're hoping to see the technology go from here.
well, the acquisition came out of, Inari had become an investor in our Series D. So,
Mhm.
they, I know people from outside look at it and say, but Inari isn't in like the PAD space, really. They do PE and DVT. I think that's the wrong way to look at it, right? I think they are a brilliant market development story, right? And I think they are an incredible market development organization, right? It's deeply embedded in their DNA. And they looked at LimFlow and said, wait a minute, it's like us, just like us 5 years ago. Big unmet need, lots of people don't believe in it. Clearly, you need to launch small and then go big once you figure out how to do it. Training and education is going to be key. Continuing R&D is going to be key. All the things we do about getting early adopters on board, continuing to develop the procedure and the therapy, staying close and thinking about patients, which is in their motto all the time. We shared so many things about how we thought about what we were doing. Yes, technology is different, right? But the ethos and the method of what we needed to do was really in line with what they know how to do and had already done. So, I mean, obviously you have a network, right? So I knew quite a number of people at Inari. Drew, the CEO, I knew him from Medtronic. So and so you're out pitching to all the companies, right? And we really clicked, right, from a vision point of view. And so they decided to invest in our Series D. And then when we came around in last year and said, well, wait a minute, we got to raise money because we're out of money, and we need to launch the product because we're getting FDA approval. So let's go out and raise a Series E, which I did. I mean, I had term sheets. And at the same time, the investors, of course, are saying, well, wait a minute, is now the time to exit? You know? And Inari stepped in at that point and said, well, we would like to, we'd like to see if we can make this happen. And so we, basically put the term sheets to the side and we focused on, getting to a deal with Inari. And it, again, I think they share the vision. They know exactly what they need to do. I think they're doing it right, and I'm really encouraged about the future.
Yeah, I mean the clot warriors, they're worried about the blockages throughout the body, right? So what a opportunity for them to kind of expand, their deliverables in different parts of the body on different diseases and problems. So yeah, it's cool. I see that bigger long-term vision. And what about for you, Dan? Where are you at these days? And what can the medtech industry expect to see for over the next 6 to 18 months?
Well, we'll see. I don't know. I mean, what I can tell you for sure is that I will not leave medtech, right? I love it too much. I get really excited about, I mean, that people bring me, I mean, talk to me about projects all the time. I'm busier than I would like to be, in fact. But I can't keep myself away because I just get excited. There's so much great technology out there and great people. And so, yeah, we'll see. We'll see how it manifests, whether I end up, in another CEO role soon, or it takes a bit longer. But that's really up to me, I think, more than anything. But yeah, I mean, I certainly am working with a couple different companies now as an advisor, and it's just so fun, right?
Mhm.
Because you get to help solve the problems, but you're not on the hook, right?
Mhm.
And this is for the moment a really satisfying place to be. But I look forward to taking on a big chunky project at some point in the future.
Well, we
And
look forward to seeing what you do next. And
yes.
so, I've been just amazed by listening to this conversation and, all the amazing pieces of information that you've packed into this. You spoke about there about having those advisory roles. If somebody wants to get in touch with Dan Rose, thinks about, hey, you would be a great advisor to have in our team. What's the best way to do that?
LinkedIn. So I believe it or not, I do respond to my LinkedIn. So if you message me that way, then that's the best way to reach me.
Awesome. Wow. Dan, this has been absolutely epic. Congratulations, of course, on the success with LimFlow and everything you managed to steer this incredible project to fruition, and super excited for obviously the future of where the company goes. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been incredible.
It's been great. I really enjoyed it. I know I get a little bit excited talking about LimFlow, so please forgive me, but it all comes back, rushing back very quickly. And yeah, it's deeply in love with the project, and really super excited to see many patients get treated with the therapy that we developed going forward.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, another huge thank you to our guest, Dan Rose, former CEO of LimFlow. And thank you for tuning in for another episode of the MedTech Impact Podcast. I'm Kyle Cruz.
And I'm Richard Meiklejohn. Until next time, keep innovating.